You know, sometimes I wonder if telling this story will make people think I've lost my mind. But at 83 years old, what do I have to lose? The truth is the truth. And what happened to my granddaughter Sarah back in 1987 changed everything I thought I knew about faith, medicine, and miracles. But before I tell you about Sarah's miracle, I need you to understand something about miracles themselves. They don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they come disguised as tragedy, wrapped in pain so deep you think it might kill you. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come in packages we'd never choose to open. I'm sitting here in my living room in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the same room where I've spent countless nights praying, crying, and hoping against hope. This old rocking chair has been my refuge for 60 years, the place where I've wrestled with God, bargained with Him, and sometimes even gotten angry with Him. The wooden arms are worn smooth from my hands, gripping them during the hardest moments of my life. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do. Can you imagine hearing those words about your own flesh and blood? Mrs. Henderson, we've done everything medically possible. Those 8 words echoed in my mind for months, like a death sentence pronounced over my granddaughter's future. But sometimes, when doctors reach the end of their knowledge, that's exactly when God's knowledge begins. Now, I need to take you back further than 1987, because this story really begins in 1982, when my daughter Margaret was diagnosed with cervical cancer at just 28 years old. Beautiful Margaret, with her infectious laugh and gentle spirit, lying in that sterile hospital bed, asking me questions I couldn't answer. "Mama, what's going to happen to Sarah if I don't make it?" Sarah was only 3 then, a tiny thing with golden curls that caught sunlight like spun gold and eyes blue as summer sky. She would toddle into Margaret's hospital room carrying her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppy, and climb up onto the bed to snuggle with her mama. Those moments are burned into my memory. The innocence of a child who didn't understand why mama was always so tired, why she had no hair, why the medicine made her so sick. For 2 years, we fought that cancer. 2 years of chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments, trips to specialists in Chicago, Minneapolis, even the Mayo Clinic. I sold my late husband's classic Chevy, the one he'd restored with his own hands, to pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover. I mortgaged this house twice, but you do whatever it takes when it's your child's life hanging in the balance. Margaret passed away on a Tuesday morning in March 1984. The dogwood tree in our yard was just beginning to bloom, those delicate white flowers she'd always loved. I remember thinking how cruel it was that spring was coming, that the world was waking up to new life. When my daughter was dying, 5-year-old Sarah was at kindergarten when it happened. I had to pick her up early and explain that Mama had gone to be with Jesus. How do you explain death to a How do you tell her that the person she loved most in the world isn't coming home ever again? Sarah looked at me with those big blue eyes and asked, "But who's going to sing me to sleep now, Grandma?" I held her close and promised, "I will, sweetheart. Grandma will always be here." And I was. For 3 years after Margaret's death, it was just Sarah and me in this old house. I taught her to make chocolate chip cookies using her great-grandmother's recipe, showed her how to tend the garden her mama had loved, read her bedtime stories in the same rocking chair where I'd once read to Margaret. We developed our own little routines, our own language of love and loss and learning to live again. Sarah was a remarkable child, resilient in the way children can be when they have no choice but to adapt. She talked to her mama's picture every night before bed, telling her about her day at school, showing her drawings she'd made, asking for advice about playground disputes. Sometimes I'd catch her having full conversations with Margaret's photograph, and my heart would break and heal simultaneously. But children who lose their mothers young carry invisible wounds. Sarah was always trying to be perfect, afraid that if she misbehaved, I might leave too. She was old beyond her years, carrying responsibility no 8-year-old should bear. When thunderstorms rolled across Iowa's flat plains, she'd climb into my bed not because she was afraid of the lightning, but because she was afraid something might happen to me during the night. It all started when Sarah was just 9 years old, on a beautiful Saturday morning in June 1987. I can still smell the honeysuckle that grew along our back fence, still hear the meadowlarks singing in the cornfield behind our property. Sarah had finished her weekly chores, made her bed with military precision, and asked if she could play outside with Tommy Richardson, the neighbor boy. Tommy was a good kid, red-haired and freckled, with parents who attended our church. His mother Helen and I had been friends since high school. had weathered marriages and motherhood together, had held each other up through divorces and deaths, and all the ordinary disasters that make up a woman's life. Tommy was 2 years older than Sarah, but gentle with her, protective in the way boys sometimes are with younger girls who've lost their mothers. That morning, they were playing some elaborate game involving my prize-winning rose garden, pretending the flower beds were kingdoms, and they were brave knights on a quest. I was on the back porch, snapping green beans for Sunday dinner, and half listening to their chatter, smiling at their creativity. The roses were in full bloom, deep red Mr. Lincoln varieties and pale pink Queen Elizabeth roses that I'd been nurturing for 15 years. Around those rose beds, I'd built decorative borders using natural fieldstone I'd collected from our old farm property. My late husband Robert had helped me design them before his heart attack in 1979. Each stone was carefully selected and placed, creating elegant raised beds that were the envy of the neighborhood garden club. Those stones represented hours of work, years of love, and pride in creating something beautiful. One moment, Sarah was laughing, her voice like wind chimes in a summer breeze, chasing a monarch butterfly that had landed on my Queen Elizabeth roses. The next moment, I heard this awful scream that still haunts my dreams 36 years later. It's a sound no grandmother should ever hear, the cry of a child in mortal pain, carrying notes of terror and confusion that pierce straight through to your soul. Tommy came running to me, his face white as fresh snow, tears streaming down his freckled cheeks, his voice breaking with panic. "Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson." Sarah fell. She tripped, chasing the butterfly, and hit her head on the garden stones. My heart stopped right there in my chest. I dropped the bowl of green beans I'd been snapping, didn't even hear them scatter across the porch floor, and ran faster than these old bones had moved in 20 years. There she was, my precious granddaughter, unconscious by the stone border I'd built with such pride just the month before. Blood was trickling from above her left eye, staining those golden curls I loved to braid every Sunday morning before church. Her little cotton dress, the yellow one with tiny daisies that had been her mama's favorite, was torn at the shoulder. She looked so small, lying there among my roses, so fragile and still. I scooped her up in my arms, feeling how light she was, how her head lolled against my shoulder. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see the delicate blue veins at her temples. Blood was seeping through my fingers as I pressed my hand against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding while my mind raced through everything I needed to do. Call 911, get her to the hospital, pray like I'd never prayed before. But in that moment, holding my unconscious granddaughter, I was transported back to 5 years earlier, to another hospital room, to my daughter's final days. I couldn't lose Sarah too. God couldn't be that cruel, could he? The drive to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Sarah's head in my lap, my hand still pressed against her wound, whispering every prayer I'd ever learned and inventing new ones as we went. The emergency room at Mercy Medical Center was chaos. Bright fluorescent lights that hurt my eyes and urgent voices calling out medical terms I didn't understand. Dr. Wilson, a kind man I'd known since he was a boy in our church's Sunday school, examined Sarah with gentle hands, while nurses bustled around taking vital signs and asking questions I could barely answer. Through my panic, "It's a significant head trauma, Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Williams said, his voice carefully controlled in that way doctors use when they're trying not to frighten you, while still conveying the seriousness of the situation. "We need to run some tests, get a CT scan, make sure there's no internal bleeding or brain swelling. She's stable right now, but head injuries in children can be unpredictable." Those words echoed in my ears like thunder rolling across the prairie. Unpredictable, brain injury, internal bleeding, all the medical nightmares that haunt every parent and grandparent were suddenly real possibilities. Not abstract fears, but concrete threats to my granddaughter's life and future. For 3 days, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness like a small boat on uncertain waters. I never left her bedside, sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair, eating cafeteria sandwiches that tasted like cardboard, holding her tiny hand and singing the lullabies I'd sung to her mother before cancer stole Margaret's voice. The same songs that had comforted my daughter during her final weeks were now my desperate offerings to God for Sarah's healing. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Grandma's gonna buy you a mockingbird, ... double quotes. My voice would crack on certain verses, the ones that reminded me too much of Margaret, but I kept singing because I believed somehow that Sarah could hear me, that my voice might be the thread that guided her back to consciousness. On the third night, alone in that sterile room with only the sound of machines monitoring my granddaughter's vital signs, I had what I can only describe as a conversation with God. Not the formal prayers we recite in church, but the raw, honest dialogue that happens when you're stripped of everything but desperation and love. "Lord," I whispered, my hand stroking Sarah's hair, "I know you took Margaret for reasons I don't understand. I've made peace with that, or at least I'm trying to. But this child, this innocent little girl who's already lost her mother, she needs a chance to live, to grow up, to experience all the joys and sorrows and ordinary miracles that make up a human life. If you're testing my faith, consider it tested. If you need me to bargain, I'll give you everything I have. Just please, please let her wake up." And she did. On Thursday morning, as the sun was streaming through the hospital room window, painting everything in shades of gold and hope, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She looked directly at me, those blue eyes, clear and focused, and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Grandma, where's Mr. Hoppy?" I laughed and cried simultaneously, my tears falling onto her hospital blanket as I reached into the bag I'd packed and pulled out her beloved stuffed rabbit. "Right here, sweetheart. Mr. Hoppy has been waiting for you to wake up." She hugged that rabbit to her chest and smiled, that sweet, innocent smile that had been lighting up my world for 9 years. Dr. Williams was amazed by her recovery. "It's remarkable," he told me privately while Sarah napped. "Brain injuries of this severity usually result in some cognitive impairment, at least initially. But her responses are perfect, her memory intact, her motor functions normal. She's a very lucky little girl." Lucky? I didn't feel lucky, but I felt grateful in ways that go deeper than words. When Sarah finally woke up fully, we thought our prayers were answered completely. She recognized everyone, remembered everything that had happened before the accident, and asked for her favorite strawberry ice cream. For a few precious weeks, life felt normal again. But, as the days passed, we began to notice a small bump forming above her left eyebrow, right where she'd hit the fieldstone. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight swelling that I thought would go down as the healing progressed. But instead of shrinking, it grew, slowly at first, then more rapidly, distorting her beautiful face in ways that broke my heart every time I looked at her. You have to understand, this was a different time. In 1987, medical options in small-town Iowa were limited, especially for complex cases like Sarah's. The internet didn't exist to research conditions or connect with other families facing similar challenges. We relied on our local doctors, medical journals in the library, and word-of-mouth recommendations from other families who'd navigated medical mysteries. Dr. Williams referred us to specialists in Des Moines, Iowa's capital city, a 3-hour drive that we made monthly for consultations and tests. Dr. Patricia Summers, a neurologist with 20 years of experience, ran every test imaginable: CT scans, MRIs, blood work, biopsies. The results were always the same: a benign tumor, growing slowly but steadily, pressing against delicate facial structures. "It's what we call a post-traumatic growth," Dr. Summers explained during one of our appointments, her voice professional but kind. "Sometimes, head injuries trigger abnormal cell growth in the healing process. The good news is that it's not cancerous. The challenging news is its location makes surgical removal extremely risky." Risky. That word followed us through consultation after consultation. From Des Moines, we were referred to specialists in Chicago, to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where doctors with impressive credentials and intimidating offices examined Sarah with instruments I'd never seen before. Each consultation ended the same way: "It's a benign tumor, but it's too close to the eye socket and important facial nerves. Surgery could result in permanent vision loss, facial paralysis, or worse complications. The risk outweighs the benefit." Finally, we made the pilgrimage to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. That temple of medical excellence where patients come from around the world seeking miracles. I'd sold my mother's wedding ring, the one family heirloom I'd planned to pass down to Sarah someday, to pay for the consultation and travel expenses. It seemed like a worthy sacrifice if it meant helping my granddaughter. The Mayo Clinic was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Marble floors and soaring ceilings, artwork that belonged in museums, and an atmosphere of quiet confidence that made you believe miracles were possible. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, chief of facial surgery, examined Sarah for 2 hours, consulting with colleagues and reviewing scans on computer screens that showed her skull from every possible angle. His conclusion was the same as all the others, delivered with the practiced sympathy of a man who'd delivered similar news thousands of times. Mrs. Henderson, your granddaughter has what we call a cranial essentially a bone tumor that developed as a result of her head trauma. While it's benign, its location makes surgical intervention extremely dangerous. We could damage her vision permanently, cause facial nerve damage, or even create brain complications. I'm afraid the best course of action is careful monitoring and learning to live with the cosmetic changes. Learning to live with the cosmetic changes. Easy words for a doctor to say. Impossible words for a grandmother to accept when she's watching her granddaughter's confidence disappeared day by day. For 6 years, from age 9 to 15. I watched Sarah transform from a carefree child into a self-conscious teenager who hid behind her hair, avoided mirrors, and stopped smiling in photographs. Do you know what it's like to watch someone you love disappear inside themselves, to see their light dim a little more each day as they become increasingly aware of how different they look from other children? The tumor continued to grow, slowly but relentlessly. By the time Sarah was 12, it protruded noticeably above her left eyebrow, creating an asymmetrical appearance that made her beautiful face look almost alien. Children at school, cruel in the way children can be without meaning real harm, called her Cyclops and Frankenstein. Teachers tried to intervene, but damage to a child's self-esteem isn't something that can be fixed with disciplinary actions. Sarah would come home from school with tear-stained cheeks, her book bag dropped carelessly by the door, seeking refuge in her bedroom where she could hide from the world's stares and whispers. Grandma, she asked me one particularly difficult day in 7th grade, why would God let this happen to me? Haven't I already lost enough with Mama dying? What do you tell a 13-year-old girl who's lost her mother and now faces each day feeling like a freak? How do you explain suffering to a child who's already endured more pain than most adults? I held her close in this same rocking chair where I'm sitting now, stroking her hair and whispering the only truth I knew. God has a plan, sweetheart. We just can't see it yet. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the darkest soil, but honestly, there were nights I questioned everything I'd ever believed about God's goodness and love, lying in my bed upstairs, staring at the ceiling and listening to Sarah cry herself to sleep in the next room. I wondered if God was even listening to our prayers. I'd been faithful my whole life, attended First Baptist Church for 60 years, tithed regularly, even when money was tight, helped every neighbor in need, volunteered for every church committee and community service project. Where was God when my daughter was dying of cancer at 20? Where was he when my granddaughter hit her head on those stones? Where was he now, as I watched this precious child withdraw further into herself with each passing day? The silence from heaven was deafening, and sometimes I wondered if I was praying to empty air. High school was particularly brutal for Sarah. Teenagers are sophisticated in their cruelty, more creative in finding ways to wound. They didn't call her names to her face anymore. They did something worse. They ignored her completely, as if her physical difference made her invisible. She ate lunch alone, sat by herself on the school bus, and declined every invitation to school dances or social events. I tried everything to help her regain confidence. Dance lessons, art classes, volunteer work at the animal shelter, where her gentle nature with injured creatures brought momentary sparks of joy to her eyes. But, at the end of every day, she still had to look in the mirror and see that tumor distorting her face. Still had to face a world that values physical perfection above all else. Her grades remained excellent. She was naturally intelligent like her mother, but she'd abandoned any dreams of college or career that would put her in front of people. I want to work in a library, she told me once, somewhere quiet, where people don't have to look at me. My heart shattered hearing those words from a girl who'd once dreamed of being a teacher like her mama. The breakthrough came in 1993, when Sarah was 16 and I was nearly at the end of my rope. My neighbor, Ethel Morrison, God bless her interfering heart, heard about our situation through the church prayer chain and mentioned it to her cousin in Rochester, New York. This cousin's daughter had faced a similar medical challenge and been treated by a surgeon there with remarkable results. Margaret, Ethel said, using my daughter's name for Sarah as she sometimes did when she was excited, you need to call this doctor. Dr. Marcus Steinberg at Strong Memorial Hospital. Ruth's daughter says he performs miracles with facial reconstruction surgery. He's developed techniques that other doctors haven't even heard of yet. I'd heard similar recommendations before, followed countless leads that ended in disappointment. But something about the certainty in Ethel's voice made me pay attention. That evening, I found Dr. Steinberg's number through directory assistance and, hand shaking with a combination of hope and fear, placed a long-distance call to Rochester. The woman who answered, Rebecca Goldman, listened to Sarah's story with such patience and compassion that I found myself telling her details I'd never shared with medical professionals before, about Margaret's death, about my fears of losing Sarah too, about watching my granddaughter's spirit break a little more each day. Dr. Steinberg would very much like to examine your granddaughter, Rebecca said when I finished. He's developed some innovative approaches to cases like hers. Would you be able to come to Rochester for a consultation? Would I be able? I would have crawled to Rochester if necessary. When can we come? I asked, already mentally calculating the cost of bus tickets and hotel rooms. How is next week? She asked. Dr. Steinberg has had a cancellation, and he's very interested in Sarah's case, based on what you've described. Next week seemed impossibly soon, but also not soon enough. I'd been waiting 6 years for hope, and suddenly it was being offered with a specific date and time. We'll be there, I promised, my voice stronger than I'd felt in years. The trip to Rochester was the longest journey of my life, both in miles and in emotional significance. Sarah, now 16 and beautiful despite the tumor that shadowed half her face, sat beside me on that Greyhound bus, her face turned toward the window, watching America roll by in a blur of farmland and small towns and endless possibility. We couldn't afford to fly, couldn't even afford a decent hotel. But I'd managed to save enough for bus tickets and 2 nights at a modest motel near the hospital. Sarah was quiet during the 13-hour journey, reading the same book over and over, lost in thoughts I couldn't penetrate. I prayed silently as the miles passed, asking God to prepare Dr. Steinberg's heart and hands for what we needed him to do. Rochester, New York, was nothing like Rochester, Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic was all marble and grandeur. Strong Memorial Hospital was utilitarian and busy, a teaching hospital affiliated with the University of Rochester, where medical students and residents hustled through corridors carrying charts and wearing expressions of serious concentration. Dr. Steinberg's office was different from any medical facility I'd ever seen. The walls were covered with before and after photographs of patients, testimonials from grateful families in multiple languages, and certificates from medical organizations around the world. When Dr. Steinberg walked in, I was surprised by his appearance. He was younger than I had expected, maybe with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and gentle hands that reminded me somehow of my late husband Robert's. He wasn't tall or imposing like the other surgeons we'd consulted, but there was something about his presence that immediately put me at ease. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd solved impossible problems before. Sarah, he said, addressing my granddaughter directly rather than speaking about her to me as other doctors had done, I want you to know that I've been thinking about your case since your grandmother called. I believe there might be options we can explore that other doctors haven't considered. He examined Sarah for what felt like hours, using instruments I'd never seen before, taking measurements with calipers, photographing her face from dozens of angles, consulting with other doctors via telephone conferences that lasted longer than most of our previous consultations combined. Throughout the examination, Dr. Steinberg explained everything he was doing, not just to me but to Sarah, treating her as a participant in her own medical care rather than simply a patient to be evaluated. I'm measuring the exact dimensions of your tumor, he told her, and calculating how much bone would need to be removed to restore normal facial contours. Finally, after nearly 4 hours of examination and consultation, he sat us down in his office and said words that changed everything. I can help her. It will be challenging surgery, requiring techniques I've been developing over the past few years, but I believe I can remove the tumor without damaging her eye, her facial nerves, or causing significant scarring. Sarah squeezed my hand so tight I thought she might break my old bones. Tears were streaming down both our faces. 6 years of pent-up hope and fear and desperate longing, finally finding release. For the first time since that terrible day in my rose garden, I saw genuine hope flicker back to life in my granddaughter's eyes. However, Dr. Steinberg continued, his voice gentle but serious. I need you both to understand that this surgery carries significant risks. The tumor has grown around important facial structures, and removing it will require working very close to your optic nerve and facial muscles. There's a possibility, small but real, of complications including vision problems, facial paralysis, or scarring. What would you do if Sarah were your granddaughter? I asked, the question that had been burning in my heart throughout his explanation. Dr. Steinberg was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. "If she were my granddaughter," he said finally, "I would want to give her every possible chance at a normal life. She's 16 years old, just beginning to discover who she wants to become. This tumor isn't just affecting her appearance, it's affecting her spirit, her confidence, her entire future. The surgical risks are real, but the risks of doing nothing are, in my opinion, much greater." The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving us time to prepare both practically and emotionally for what lay ahead. Those were simultaneously the longest and shortest 6 weeks of my life. Long because every day felt like an eternity of waiting and worrying. Short because there was so much to arrange and prepare for what could be either Sarah's healing or her further damage. I prayed more during those 6 weeks than I'd prayed in my entire previous life combined. Not just the formal prayers we recite in church, but constant conversation with God about every detail of the upcoming surgery. I prayed for Dr. Steinberg's hands, for Sarah's healing, for strength to face whatever outcome awaited us. Our little Baptist church in Cedar Rapids had never seen such unified prayer for one person. Pastor Williams, no relation to our doctor but a man who'd shepherded our congregation through countless crises, organized prayer, vigils, and healing services. The entire community seemed to rally around Sarah's story. People who barely knew us sent cards and flowers, offered to help with expenses, promised to pray for successful surgery. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, and I want all of you watching to pay close attention to this part because it changed not just Sarah's life, but mine, and maybe it will touch yours too in ways you can't imagine right now. Before I continue with what happened next, I want to pause for a moment and ask all of you beautiful people watching this story, where are you tuning in from? Are you in California, dealing with your own family medical crisis? Texas, maybe caring for aging parents? New York, juggling work and worry about a child's future? Maybe you're watching from another country altogether, facing challenges I can't even imagine. Please, take a moment to let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know that this story is reaching people all over the world. People who understand what it's like to fight for someone you love, to hope against hope when doctors offer no solutions, to pray prayers that seem to disappear into silence. And if you've ever faced something that seemed impossible, something that tested every belief you ever held about God's goodness or fairness, something that made you question whether faith has any real power in the face of medical reality, I want you to know that you're not alone. Sometimes our greatest trials become the doorway to our greatest miracles, but we can't see that when we're in the middle of the storm. The night before surgery, I was sitting in the hospital chapel at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, a small, quiet room with stained glass windows that cast rainbow colors across the wooden pews even at night, illuminated by street lights and the glow of the city beyond. I was alone with my thoughts, my fears, and my desperate need to believe that everything would work out according to God's plan. I wasn't reciting memorized prayers or speaking in the formal language we use during Sunday services. I was talking to God like I would talk to my best friend, because at that moment, He was all I had. The conversation went something like this: "Lord, I've served you faithfully for 70 years. I've tried to live according to your word, to treat people with kindness, to be generous with what little I have. I've never asked for much for myself, just the basic necessities and the strength to care for my family. But I'm asking now, begging really, for something that might seem impossible. Tomorrow, Dr. Steinberg is going to take a scalpel to my granddaughter's face, cut into bone and tissue that surrounds her eye and brain, try to remove a tumor that has been growing for 6 years. The margin for error is so small that one tiny mistake could blind her, paralyze her face, or worse. I can't bear the thought of her facing more suffering than she's already endured. If you're testing my faith, consider it tested. If you need me to prove my devotion, I'll spend the rest of my life in service to others. If you want me to understand suffering so I can comfort others who suffer, I understand now more than I ever wanted to. But please, please guide Dr. Steinberg's hands tomorrow. Give my granddaughter her life back, not just her health but her confidence, her joy, her chance at all the experiences that make life worth living." And then something remarkable happened that I still get chills thinking about 30 years later. I felt this peace wash over me. starting from somewhere deep in my chest and spreading through my whole body like warm honey on a cold morning. It wasn't dramatic. No bright lights or angelic voices like you see in movies, just this deep, profound certainty that everything was going to be all right. For the first time in 6 years, since that terrible day in my rose garden when Sarah hit her head, I felt genuine peace, not hope, which is future-focused and uncertain, but peace, which is present and sure. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that God had heard my prayer and was already working on Sarah's behalf. I slept that night in the hospital family waiting room, curled up in an uncomfortable chair, but I slept better than I had in months. When I woke at dawn, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and I felt ready to face whatever the day would bring. The surgery began at 7 in the morning and was scheduled to last approximately 6 hours. 6 hours of waiting, pacing hospital corridors, drinking terrible vending machine coffee, and clutching my worn Bible like a lifeline. I'd brought the same Bible I'd carried through Margaret's illness, its pages marked with tear stains and underlined with verses that had sustained me through previous trials. Other families populated the surgical waiting room, each dealing with their own medical crises, their own desperate prayers. I found myself comforting a young mother whose baby was having heart surgery, sharing tissues with an elderly man whose wife was having a brain tumor removed, offering silent prayers for strangers who were fighting battles as difficult as our own. Around noon, a surgical nurse came to update me on Sarah's progress. "Dr. Steinberg wanted me to let you know that everything is proceeding well," she said. "The tumor removal is more complex than expected, but he's pleased with how things are going. It will probably be another 4 hours before he's finished. 4 more hours of waiting, 4 more hours of prayer, 4 more hours of bargaining with God and trying to stay positive for Sarah's sake." I called our pastor in Iowa to update him and the prayer chain, spoke briefly with Ethel Morrison, who was watching my house and watering my roses, tried to eat a sandwich that tasted like cardboard because my stomach was churned with anxiety. Finally, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Dr. Steinberg emerged from the operating room, still in his scrubs, looking exhausted but wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it good news or bad news? Success or complications? My heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst as he walked toward me, across that waiting room. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, and his voice carried a note of wonder that I'll never forget. "The surgery was successful beyond my most optimistic expectations. Not only were we able to remove the entire tumor, but I was able to preserve all of Sarah's facial nerves. Her eye function is perfect, and the cosmetic results should be excellent once the swelling goes down." I started crying right there in that waiting room, tears of relief and gratitude and overwhelming joy. Other families looked over, and I saw them smile, understanding that good news for one family gives hope to everyone facing similar trials. But Dr. Steinberg wasn't finished. He sat down beside me, his expression thoughtful and slightly puzzled. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to tell you something that I've never experienced in 25 years of surgery. During the most delicate part of the operation, when I was working closest to Sarah's optic nerve and facial structures, I felt like I wasn't alone in that operating room." I looked at him, not sure what he meant, waiting for him to explain this strange confession from a man of science. "My hands were steadier than they've ever been," he continued. "My vision was clearer, my decisions more certain. I found myself making surgical choices that I hadn't planned, using techniques that seemed to come from somewhere beyond my training. It was as if someone else was guiding my hands, showing me exactly where to cut, exactly how to proceed." Chills ran down my spine as I listened to this brilliant surgeon, this man who'd spent decades perfecting his craft, describe what I knew was the presence of God in that operating room. "I'm not typically a religious man, Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Steinberg admitted. "I'm Jewish by heritage, but secular in practice. I believe in what I can see and prove through scientific method. But what happened today during Sarah's surgery challenges everything I thought I knew about the nature of healing." 2 weeks later, when they removed Sarah's bandages, the miracle was complete. Where that awful tumor had disfigured her face for 6 years, distorting her features and destroying her confidence, there was now just a thin, barely visible scar that makeup could easily cover. But more than the physical healing, Sarah's spirit had returned. She was looking in mirrors again, smiling spontaneously, making plans for her senior year of high school. The girl who'd hidden behind her hair and avoided photographs was suddenly interested in school. dances, and college applications. It was like watching someone come back from the dead. Resurrection in the most literal sense. Dr. Steinberg asked to see us one more time before we returned to Iowa. In his office, surrounded by those before and after photographs of other patients he'd helped, he made a confession that still moves me to tears. "Mrs. Henderson, Sarah, I need to tell you both something. What happened during this surgery has changed how I think about my work, about healing, about the possibility that there are forces in this universe beyond what medical textbooks can explain. I've been reading about prayer, about faith, about the connection between spiritual and physical healing." He paused, looking directly at Sarah, whose face now showed no trace of the deformity that had marked 6 years of her young life. "I want you to know that I've decided to establish a foundation to help children whose families can't afford the kind of surgery you needed. If there's really a God who guided my hands during your operation, then these hands belong to him, and I need to use them to help other children whose families pray just like your grandmother did." That conversation marked the beginning of the Steinberg Foundation for Pediatric Facial Reconstruction, which has since helped over 3,000 children from families who had nowhere else to turn. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened when we got home to Cedar Rapids. The transformation in Sarah was nothing short of miraculous. Not just her physical appearance, though that was dramatic enough, but her entire spirit seemed to unfold like a flower that had been closed for too long. The girl who'd spent 6 years hiding from the world suddenly couldn't wait to rejoin it. Her first day back at school was one I'll never forget. I drove her that morning, both of us nervous about how her classmates would react to her dramatically changed appearance. Sarah had chosen her outfit carefully, a blue sweater that matched her eyes and brought out the golden highlights in her hair. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to hide. When she got home that afternoon, she was practically glowing with excitement. "Grandma, you won't believe what happened. Jenny Morrison, you know, Ethel's granddaughter who's in my chemistry class, she didn't even recognize me at first. And Tyler Henderson, no relation to us, but he sits behind me in history. He asked if I was new to the school." But the most important change wasn't how others saw Sarah, it was how she began to see herself. She started spending time in front of mirrors again, not with the critical, painful scrutiny of someone cataloging flaws, but with the normal teenage interest in hair and makeup and discovering her own emerging beauty. The college applications that had been gathering dust on her desk suddenly became active projects. Sarah had always been academically gifted, but her grades in her junior year had been her best ever, as if removing that tumor had also removed some internal limitation she'd placed on her own potential. "I want to study medicine, Grandma," she announced one evening over dinner. "I want to help people the way Dr. Steinberg helped me. Maybe pediatrics, working with children who are facing scary medical situations." Hearing those words, seeing the determination and purpose in her eyes, I knew that Sarah's suffering hadn't been meaningless. God had been preparing her for something bigger than we could have imagined during those dark years when her future seemed so limited. But you know what's funny about miracles? They don't just affect the person who receives them. They ripple outward in ways you never expect, touching lives you might not even know about until years later. 3 months after Sarah's surgery, I received a phone call that surprised me. It was Dr. Steinberg calling, not about Sarah's medical care, which was progressing perfectly, but about something entirely different. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, and I could hear excitement in his voice. "I wanted you to know that what happened during Sarah's surgery has led me to make some significant changes in my practice. I've been reading the Bible you left for me, studying about faith and prayer, and I've had some remarkable experiences with other patients that I can't explain through medical science alone." He went on to tell me about a little boy named Miguel, whose family had driven from Mexico City, seeking help for a facial deformity similar to Sarah's. They had no insurance, very limited English, and absolutely no way to pay for the surgery their son desperately needed. Normally, our hospital's financial policies would have made it impossible to help them, Dr. Steinberg explained. But I kept thinking about Sarah, about the way I felt God's presence during her surgery, and I knew I had to find a way. I performed Miguel's surgery pro bono, and something extraordinary happened again. That same supernatural steadiness of hands, that same unusual clarity of judgment, that same sense of divine guidance that had marked Sarah's surgery. Miguel's operation was equally successful, and his family returned to Mexico with their son's face restored and their faith in miracles confirmed. Word spread through the Hispanic community about this Jewish surgeon who prayed before operations and performed miracles for children whose families couldn't pay. Soon, Dr. Steinberg was receiving calls from across the country, desperate parents seeking help for children with facial deformities, cleft palates, tumor growths, and birth defects that other doctors deemed too risky to repair. I've realized something profound, Dr. Steinberg told me during one of our regular phone conversations that continued for years after Sarah's surgery. My medical training taught me to rely on my own skill and knowledge, but Sarah's case taught me that healing involves partnership with something far greater than my own abilities. Now I pray before every surgery, asking for guidance and wisdom beyond what textbooks can provide. The Steinberg Foundation, officially launched 2 years after Sarah's surgery, I was invited to the dedication ceremony in Rochester, where Dr. Steinberg publicly credited Sarah's case as the inspiration for his decision to dedicate his career to helping children from disadvantaged families. This foundation exists because of a brave young girl from Iowa and her praying grandmother, he announced to the gathered crowd of medical professionals and grateful families. They taught me that medicine without faith is incomplete, that healing involves not just technical skill, but spiritual partnership with the divine. Sarah and I were both crying as we listened to his words. To think that our private struggle, our desperate prayers in hospital chapels, our years of medical disappointments had somehow contributed to helping thousands of other families facing similar challenges. It was almost too wonderful to comprehend, but the ripple effects of Sarah's miracle extended beyond Dr. Steinberg's practice. When we returned to Cedar Rapids, our story spread through the community like wildfire. Our church began organizing prayer groups specifically for families facing medical crises. Understanding now that miraculous healing was still possible in the modern world, Pastor Williams started inviting me to share Sarah's story at other churches throughout Iowa and neighboring states. I was initially reluctant. I'm not a public speaker, just a grandmother who'd witnessed God's power in action. But I began to understand that testimonies about God's goodness are meant to be shared, not hidden. At one particular service in Davenport, Iowa, I met a family whose situation was heartbreakingly similar to ours. Little Amanda Chen, adopted from China by American parents, had been born with a severe cleft palate that multiple surgeries had failed to fully correct. Her parents, David and Susan Chen, had exhausted their insurance coverage and faced the prospect of their daughter growing up with significant facial differences. After I shared Sarah's story, Susan Chen approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, do you think Dr. Steinberg would consider examining Amanda? We've been praying for a miracle, but we didn't know where to find one." I took down their contact information and called Dr. Steinberg the next day. Within a week, the Chen family was in Rochester, where Dr. Steinberg not only agreed to treat Amanda, but connected them with foundation funding to cover all expenses. Amanda's surgery was as successful as Sarah's had been. More importantly, her case became part of a growing body of evidence that Dr. Steinberg was documenting about the connection between prayer, faith, and surgical outcomes. He was beginning to develop medical papers about what he carefully termed enhanced surgical performance in faith support environments. This wasn't just New Age thinking or wishful believing. Dr. Steinberg was meticulously documenting improved surgical outcomes, reduced complication rates, and faster healing times in cases where families were actively praying and faith communities were involved in supporting the healing process. Major medical journals were initially skeptical, but Dr. Steinberg's reputation for scientific rigor and his impressive surgical success rates made his research impossible to ignore. He was invited to present his findings at medical conferences around the world, sharing data that suggested spiritual factors might play measurable roles in physical healing. Sarah, meanwhile, was thriving in ways we'd never dared to imagine during those dark years. Her senior year of high school was everything I'd prayed it would be, filled with normal teenage experiences that had been impossible when she was hiding from the world. She was elected to the student council, joined the drama club despite having no previous acting experience, and even accepted an invitation to the senior prom from a nice young man named David Morrison, Ethel's grandson, who'd known Sarah since childhood but was seeing her with new eyes now that her confidence had returned. College acceptance letters arrived throughout the spring of her senior year. Sarah had applied to pre-med programs at several universities, and to our amazement, She was accepted everywhere she applied. Her essay about overcoming medical challenges and her determination to help other children facing similar struggles had clearly resonated with admissions committees. She chose the University of Iowa, partly for the excellent medical program, but mostly because it was close enough to home that she could visit regularly. "I'm not ready to be too far from you yet, Grandma," she told me. "You're the one who never gave up believing in miracles. But here's something that might surprise you. Something I want everyone watching this to really think about. The most profound changes weren't in Sarah or even in Dr. Steinberg. The most profound changes were in me, in my understanding of how God works in the world and why He sometimes allows suffering that seems senseless and cruel. During those 6 years when Sarah was disfigured, when I was praying prayers that seemed to go unanswered, when I was questioning God's goodness and wondering if faith had any real power in the face of medical reality, God was working on a much larger plan than just my granddaughter's healing. He was preparing Dr. Steinberg for a ministry of healing that would eventually help thousands of children. He was developing Sarah's character and compassion in ways that would make her an extraordinary nurse and eventually a medical missionary. He was strengthening my faith to a point where I could share this testimony with people all over the world. Most importantly, he was demonstrating that miracles don't always happen on our timeline or in the ways we expect. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in packages we'd never choose to open, disguised as tragedies that turn out to be doorways to purpose and meaning we never could have imagined. During Sarah's sophomore year at the University of Iowa, she called me with news that made my heart nearly burst with pride and joy. She'd been accepted into a special program that would allow her to spend a summer working with Dr. Steinberg's foundation, assisting with surgeries for children from developing countries who were being brought to Rochester for procedures they couldn't receive in their home countries. "Grandma," she said, her voice filled with excitement, "Dr. Steinberg specifically requested me for the program. He said my experience as a patient would make me invaluable in helping other children understand what they're facing, and that recovery is not only possible but can be the beginning of something wonderful." That summer, Sarah assisted with over 50 surgeries. She held the hands of frightened children before they went into operating rooms, translated for families who spoke languages other than English, and shared her own before and after photographs with parents who needed to see proof that their children's faces could be restored. But the most meaningful moment came when she met Maria Santos, a 7-year-old girl from Guatemala who'd been born with a facial tumor remarkably similar to Sarah's post-accident growth. Maria's parents had sold everything they owned to bring her to Rochester. Having heard about the miracle surgeon who helped children for free, Sarah spent hours with Maria and her family, showing them pictures of her own face before and after surgery, teaching Maria simple English phrases to communicate with the medical staff, and most importantly, giving them hope that their daughter's future could be completely different from her present circumstances. During Maria's surgery, Sarah was allowed to observe from the surgical viewing area. She watched Dr. Steinberg's hands move with that same supernatural precision she'd heard him describe, witnessed the careful removal of tissue that had distorted Maria's face since birth, and saw the immediate transformation that surgical skill combined with divine guidance could accomplish. After the surgery, Dr. Steinberg found Sarah in the recovery area, where she was sitting beside Maria's bed, holding the little girl's hand as she woke up from anesthesia. "You know," he said quietly, "watching you with these children, seeing how your own experience enables you to give them comfort and hope. I finally understand why Sarah had to go through what she did. God was preparing her for this ministry, for this ability to help other families navigate medical challenges with faith and courage." That conversation crystallized something I'd been thinking about for years. Sarah's accident, those 6 years of disfigurement and social isolation, her miraculous healing, they were all part of a larger story that extended far beyond our family's experience. God had been writing a story of redemption and purpose that would ultimately touch thousands of lives around the world. Sarah graduated from the University of Iowa with highest honors and was accepted into the nursing program at Johns Hopkins University, one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country. But before starting her advanced studies, she made a decision that didn't surprise me but made me prouder than any academic achievement could have. She requested a year-long delay in her enrollment so she could volunteer full-time with Dr. Steinberg's foundation, traveling to countries where children with facial deformities had no access to surgical care. She wanted to be part of medical mission trips that would bring healing directly to communities that couldn't come to Rochester. Her first mission trip was to Kenya, where she worked with a team of doctors and nurses, providing free surgeries in rural hospitals with limited resources. The conditions were challenging, the cases often more severe than anything she'd encountered in Rochester. But Sarah thrived in that environment. She sent me letters describing children whose lives were being transformed by surgeries that took only a few hours but changed everything about their futures. Children who'd been hidden by their families because of facial deformities were suddenly able to attend school, participate in community life, and dream of possibilities that had been unimaginable before surgery. But it was during her second mission trip to Guatemala, where Maria Santos lived, that Sarah experienced her own divine encounter, one that would shape the rest of her life and career. She was working in a small hospital in the mountains outside Guatemala City, assisting with a particularly complex surgery on a teenage boy whose face had been severely burned in a cooking fire when he was a child. The surgery required techniques that stretched even Dr. Steinberg's considerable abilities, and the entire medical team was praying for successful outcomes. During the most critical part of the operation, Sarah later told me, she felt something extraordinary happen. She was assisting Dr. Steinberg, handing him instruments and monitoring the patient's vital signs, when she suddenly became aware of a presence in that operating room that went beyond the medical team. "Grandma," she said during our weekly phone call. "I felt like Mama was there with us, guiding our hands, showing us exactly what to do." I know that sounds crazy, but I swear I could almost see her standing beside the operating table, smiling at me the way she used to when I was little. The surgery was completely successful, and the young man's face was restored to near normal appearance. But more than that, Sarah had experienced her own confirmation of the spiritual dimension, of healing that had marked her recovery and Dr. Steinberg's transformation. When she returned from Guatemala, Sarah made another decision that would have shocked anyone who'd known her during those difficult years. When her own disfigurement made her want to hide from the world, she changed her career focus from general nursing to pediatric plastic surgery, deciding to become a surgeon herself rather than just assisting others. "I want to be able to offer children what Dr. Steinberg offered me," she explained. "Not just surgical skill, but faith-supported healing, the combination of medical expertise and spiritual partnership that makes real miracles possible." Medical school was challenging, but Sarah approached her studies with the same determination she'd shown in overcoming her own medical challenges. She specialized in pediatric facial reconstruction, studying under Dr. Steinberg during summers and learning not just surgical techniques but his approach to combining prayer with medical practice. By the time Sarah completed her residency, Dr. Steinberg was in his 70s and beginning to think about retirement. The foundation he'd established had grown into an international organization with affiliated doctors in dozens of countries, all committed to providing free surgical care for children from disadvantaged families. "I want you to consider taking over leadership of the foundation," Dr. Steinberg told Sarah during her final year of residency. "You understand its mission, not just intellectually but from personal experience. You know what it's like to live with facial disfigurement, to experience miraculous healing, and to witness God's power working through medical practice." Sarah accepted that responsibility with humility and excitement. At 32 years old, she became the youngest person ever to head a major international medical foundation. But her age was less important than her unique qualifications for the role. Under Sarah's leadership, the foundation expanded its mission beyond surgery to include counseling services for families, support groups for children facing similar challenges, and educational programs that trained doctors around the world in both surgical techniques and faith-integrated medical practice. But the most meaningful development was the establishment of healing retreats, where families could come not just for medical treatment, but for spiritual support, prayer, and community with others who understood their struggles. These retreats combined medical conferences with worship services, surgical procedures with prayer sessions, and clinical care with pastoral counseling. I was invited to speak at the first healing retreat, sharing the story of Sarah's miracle with families who were just beginning their own journeys toward healing. Standing before hundreds of parents and children, many facing medical challenges similar to what we'd experienced, I felt the full circle of God's plan coming together. One family particularly touched my heart. The Johnsons from Alabama had driven 18 hours to Rochester with their 9-year-old son Marcus, who'd been born with a severe cleft palate that multiple surgeries had failed to fully correct. Marcus was exactly Sarah's age when her accident happened, and his parents carried the same desperate hope, mixed with fear, that I'd carried into Dr. Steinberg's office 25 years earlier. After my presentation, Mrs. Johnson approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, your story gives me hope that Marcus's challenges might have purpose beyond what we can see right now. Maybe God is preparing him for something wonderful that we can't imagine yet." I held her hands and shared the same promise that had sustained me through Zara's darkest years. God has a plan for Marcus that's bigger and more beautiful than anything you can imagine right now. Your job is just to keep believing, keep praying, and keep trusting that love always wins in the end. Marcus's surgery was scheduled for the following week, performed by Sarah herself, with Dr. Steinberg assisting. I was given permission to observe from the viewing area, watching my granddaughter's hands move with the same supernatural steadiness that had marked her own healing surgery 25 years earlier. The operation was flawlessly successful, and Marcus's face was restored to normal appearance with virtually no visible scarring. But what moved me most was watching Sarah comfort Marcus as he woke up from anesthesia, sharing her own story of healing and hope, helping him understand that his surgery wasn't just about fixing his face, but about preparing him for a future filled with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. 3 years later, Marcus Johnson sent Sarah a graduation photo from high school, where he'd been elected student body president and was heading to college on a full scholarship to study medicine. His letter included a line that made both Sarah and me cry. "Dr. Sarah, you didn't just fix my face. You showed me that God can use our worst experiences to create our greatest purposes." That letter represents everything our family's journey has taught me about suffering, healing, and the mysterious ways God works in human lives. Sometimes our greatest trials become other people's greatest blessings. Sometimes what looks like tragedy is actually the first chapter of a story about redemption and purpose that will unfold over decades. As I sit here today, looking back on 36 years since Sarah's accident, I can see God's hand in every detail of our story. The random seeming accident that started everything, the 6 years of struggle that built Sarah's character and compassion, the miraculous healing that restored her face and her future, the ripple effects that have touched thousands of families around the world. Dr. Steinberg, now retired but still involved with the foundation as an advisor, has performed over 10,000 surgeries in his career, many of them guided by the same spiritual partnership he first experienced during Sarah's operation. He credits that single surgery with transforming not just his medical practice, but his entire understanding of life, faith, and the purpose of human suffering. Sarah has now performed over 2,000 surgeries herself, each one approached with prayer and the same combination of technical skill and spiritual dependency that marked her own healing. The foundation she leads has affiliate programs in 43 countries and has provided free surgical care for over 15,000 children whose families had nowhere else to turn. But beyond the numbers and statistics, what moves me most is watching Sarah with her patients and their families. She has a gift for helping children understand that their medical challenges aren't punishments or accidents, but preparation for purposes they're still too young to understand. Last month, Sarah called me with news that made my 83-year-old heart sing with joy. She and her husband David, a wonderful man who sees her not as someone who overcame disfigurement, but as someone whose faith and strength inspire everyone she meets, are expecting their first child. "Grandma," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "When I think about this baby growing inside me, I'm so grateful for everything that happened, even the hard parts. If I hadn't gone through what I did, I wouldn't be able to help all the children I've helped, and I wouldn't understand how precious every moment of normal life really is." That conversation reminded me of something I've learned over 8 decades of living. God wastes nothing. Every tear, every prayer, every moment of suffering that seems meaningless at the time, God is weaving it all together into a story of redemption that's more beautiful than anything we could write ourselves. The baby is due in the spring, right around the anniversary of Sarah's accident. We've already decided that this child, whether boy or girl, will grow up knowing the story of the miracle that made their mother's life possible. The accident that seemed tragic but turned out to be the beginning of everything wonderful. And you know what? Sometimes late at night, when I'm rocking in this same chair, where I've spent so many hours praying and worrying and hoping, I think about Margaret, my daughter, who died so young from cancer. I believe she can see what her little girl has become, how her life has touched thousands of other families, how her suffering was transformed into purpose and meaning beyond anything we could have imagined. I believe Margaret is proud of the woman Sarah became, Proud of the way our family's story has brought hope to so many others facing impossible medical situations. I believe that in God's economy, nothing is ever wasted. Every tear has purpose. And even our deepest losses can become someone else's greatest gain. Now, as I finish sharing this story with all of you beautiful people watching from around the world, I want you to know that miracles are still happening every day. Not always in the dramatic ways you see in movies. Not always on our preferred timeline. But God is still in the miracle business. If you're facing something that seems impossible today, if you're sitting beside a hospital bed holding someone's hand and wondering if God sees your pain, if you're praying prayers that seem to disappear into silence, please don't give up hope. The same God who guided Dr. Steinberg's hands during Sarah's surgery is still working miracles today. The same God who transformed our family's tragedy into a story of redemption and purpose is writing your story too. Even when you can't see how the chapters will fit together, keep praying, keep believing, keep looking for the ways God might be working even in your darkest hours. And remember, sometimes our greatest trials become other people's greatest blessings. Your story isn't over yet. God might be preparing something beautiful that will help others in ways you can't even imagine right now. Thank you for listening to an old woman's testimony about the faithfulness of God and the power of never giving up hope. Thank you for letting me share the miracle that changed not just my granddaughter's face, but our entire family's understanding of faith, healing, and God's incredible love for His children. May God bless each of you watching this, wherever you are in the world, whatever challenges you're facing. Remember, He's still in the miracle business, and your miracle might be just around the corner. Sometimes you just have to keep believing long enough to see how beautiful the ending really is.